My special guest is a distinguished economist with a history of exemplary service to Jamaica and the Caribbean region. Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal, OJ. Ambassador Bernal has served as Pro Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs at the University of the West Indies, as a member of the Board of Directors of the Inter-American Development Bank, as Chief Trade Negotiator for CARICOM and Director General for the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery. As Jamaica's Ambassador to the United States of America, Ambassador Bernal served as Jamaica's longest serving ambassador in Washington. He's the author of 6 books and 100 articles and in scholarly journals, books, monographs, etc. Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal, welcome to Real Talk.
Thank you, Ambassador Curtis Ward. Always a pleasure to speak with you. It's always a learning experience when we have our discussions. Very pleased to be joining you, and I thank you for that lengthy introduction. It may have raised expectations which I might not be able to meet.
Well, I would not have used that introduction if I didn't think you will exceed those expectations. I have every confidence in my special guest today. Ambassador Bernal, you have a lot of experience. You have spoken and written about Caribbean economies, Jamaican Caribbean economies, and I really want to get your viewpoints on some very important issues that we are facing. But to begin with, I'd like for you to give me an overview of the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on Caribbean economies, and what are the prospects in the post-COVID era.
Let me begin by going back before the pandemic. The Caribbean economies experienced some unfortunate developments. First, there was the loss of economic preferences for some of the main exports, such as sugar and banana, particularly affecting the Eastern Caribbean islands. In addition, after 2008, when there was a global financial crisis, there was a slowdown in tourism. Tourism took a hit, but eventually recovered and has grown steadily over the last 10 or more years until the pandemic took place. Against this background, the economies were struggling with low growth and finding it difficult to operate on a sustained economic basis. Along came the global pandemic, which has affected these economies. Initially, by what has happened at the global level, a slowdown in tourism in particular, and also within the economy, there have been dislocations in many industries that had depended on tourism and exports, etc. And so these economies have been very badly hit. They have lost significant growth in the last 2 to 3 years in a context where growth was already very low. The result has been increased fiscal deficits, increased government debt, and higher rates of unemployment and underutilization of productive capacity. The pandemic was an unexpected event which no one in the world was fully prepared for. The Caribbean found it very difficult to sustain the acquisition of vaccines because of the vaccine diplomacy of certain developed countries that had the capacity and retained most of the supplies. The result was that the vaccination process was fairly slow in these economies. In order to control the pandemic, in addition to mounting a campaign of vaccination, these countries sought to insulate themselves from incoming bearers of the virus by restricting travel. At the same time, tourism declined very significantly. And for most of the economies, tourism is the engine of economic growth. We are now in a situation where many people thought we would be in a post-pandemic era. We're not. We have a continuation of the mutation of the vaccine, of the virus in different forms. And indeed, we may now be living in an era of being prone to pandemics. This may not be the only one, and we may not see the last of this. Remember that diseases like malaria and influenza were epidemics, and then they became pandemics, but we have learned to live with them because we have vaccination and healthcare policies. So we may have to continue to live with the current COVID in its various mutations, and we should be alert to other emerging pandemics. As the world is so globally integrated, so many people moving legally and illegally, it's almost impossible to isolate an outbreak in any one country or region.
Absolutely.
The economies have gradually relaxed their domestic and their international travel requirements. And remarkably, global tourism has begun to recover, no doubt because in the source countries, people had been locked down, they had been restricted in social activity, and they were just desperate to get out, relax, etc. And the Caribbean has experienced a resurgence of tourism. Hopefully, the current strains of the COVID will not restrain this surge in tourism arrivals. So at this time, the economy in this pandemic-prone era is in a very fragile state because while there is some growth, the growth is taking place with an accumulation of fiscal deficits and government debt at very, very high levels.
What you just said, Ambassador Bernal, is that we are still at risk, and quite rightly so. The traveling public out of the countries which come to the Caribbean, they are coming from countries where the vaccination rate is extremely high. Plus the herd immunity is also extremely high. Unfortunately, in the Caribbean, the vaccination rate is extremely low. So the risk is there, not just from the traveling public, but within the countries themselves. Community spread is still a serious problem. But we have to move forward, as it seems we are trying to do throughout the Caribbean at the moment. But the Caribbean and the global economy has been hit by a double whammy. Coming out of COVID, we now have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has created challenges to food security and the supply chain of food, and increased in energy costs based on restrictions on oil and so on. Give me your perspectives on how the Russia-Ukraine war is affecting the Caribbean now, and how do you see the Caribbean emerging, not just in the economic space, but in the geopolitical space?
The Ukraine war has exposed the continuing structural and institutional weaknesses of the small countries, in particular, the high dependence on energy imports, almost 100% in some countries, as well as dependence on certain basic foodstuffs. This has come at a time when the economies are fragile and just beginning to emerge with some fleeting and nascent elements of economic growth driven by tourism. Fortunately, remittances have remained very high and helping to sustain these
That
economies.
is something I'd like to address separately, but you
Yes,
can,
sure.
yeah.
Now, one of the mistakes that was made was to assume that there would not be military conflict in the Ukraine and that this was just Russia threatening in order to secure the non-membership of Ukraine in NATO. Second mistake that was made globally was to assume, and the Russians made this mistake as well, that the war is going to be over in a short time. It's obvious that it's going to take a much longer time. It's obvious that the damage will be far greater than a short conflict. And it's obvious that the population that remains there will continue to resist. And therefore, we are at least in a medium-term scenario in terms of the fallout which comes from it. Now, the fallout starts with energy. Russia is a major supplier of oil in the world and natural gas, particularly to certain countries in Europe. That will affect them, and that in turn will have a multiplier of negative effects across the global economy. Russia may still be able to carry out sales of oil to countries like India and to countries in Africa, both of whom have not taken a particular side in the conflict. Food supplies are very important, particularly to the Caribbean. The reason is that Russia is the leading exporter of wheat, and Ukraine is number 5. The Ukraine is also a supplier of other agricultural and food products, and as well certain important raw materials like potassium, which goes into fertilizers, but corn, which goes into animal feed, and the production of meat protein in the Caribbean is entirely dependent on imported corn and other grains. So basic chicken prices will go up. The impact immediately is that oil, which is indispensable, will now cost more. There is a risk that countries that are committed to supply could justifiably release themselves from their commitments on the basis that these were exceptional circumstances. The result is, in addition to higher prices for oil, it's just the sheer availability of oil. The Caribbean countries, except for Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, are almost entirely dependent on imported oil, and their storage capacity is very limited. When the price of oil goes up, transportation goes up as gasoline and diesel prices go up, electricity goes up. Those two things are major input into everything that's produced domestically in these economies. So you're going to have imported inflation, and it's going to hit particularly the poor because it's basic food prices like bread and cornmeal and transportation, which is an unavoidable necessity. In addition to that, the food is going to be more expensive. The Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome in February, before the war, indicated that food prices this year were 20% higher than the year before at the same time. In addition to that, now with these disruptions in supply, disruptions in productive capacity, it means that food prices have already gone up. They've already gone up because the importers are now moving their price of existing stock up in anticipation of how much more they'll have to pay for the next shipment. So even before the imported price has gone up, they have already marked up.
Yeah.
And these are basic food items which are not easily substitutable in the Caribbean. And it's going to affect everything from bread to chicken meat.
I want to follow up a little bit on that because we like to say, eat what you grow. But the dynamics are not as simple as that because, as you quite rightly pointed out, the cost of fertilizer, the cost of chicken feed, and other feeds for other stuff are climbing globally. And Jamaica import all of this stuff. The Caribbean import all of this stuff. I believe Trinidad may manufacture some fertilizer. But again, the price that they are going to be selling for is based on global prices, not Caribbean prices, not Trinidad prices, not Jamaica prices, or elsewhere in the Caribbean. The prices for energy, the cost of fertilizer, the cost of feedstock will be based on global prices. That's the first thing. I know you can elaborate on that because your area of expertise is part of the whole economic development structure that we have inherited and which we have perpetuated over the years. Not all countries in the Caribbean have an agricultural sector which can even be improved to feed themselves. So the Caribbean as a whole are net importers of food. So I'm going all over the place with this, but I believe all of these things are important for us to consider. And so when you hear somebody say, eat what you grow, expand agriculture, the input is where the cost is. The labor hasn't moved, but it is the external input. So give me your perspective on this and whether this is a viable option for the future of the Caribbean.
The Caribbean exhibits a very high level of food import dependence. It has grown because of the needs of the tourist industry, but the problems with it are the followers. Many of the products are not easily substitutable for. There's not an easy substitute for wheat within the Caribbean. And therefore, even if domestic production of other food items increases, the substitutability is quite limited. In addition, the agriculture sector faces many problems in the Caribbean. Small size of farmers, low use of technology, increased fertilizer price, transportation problems, marketing problems, and many other aspects of this. There's also, unfortunately, a very high propensity to consume imported foods. The company will remain nameless, but there's a company that imports coconut water into Jamaica from Malaysia in a tin. That is bad enough.
Can I just intervene here for a moment?
Yes.
Because there's a popular Jamaican company who shall remain nameless, as you say, that sells its products in the diaspora market, and coconut water comes from Thailand.
Yes. Well, to come back to my point, that's bad enough. That's bad enough. But what is bad is I've seen people walk past the coconut vendor outside with fresh coconut, go into the supermarket, past the refrigerated coconut water, and pick up a tin of coconut water and purchase it at a high price. So I'm just explaining that the problems relate to the consumer as much as the producer, but in particular the importers. The importers will import just about anything. And their argument is that they cannot maintain supplies on a consistent basis because local production is seasonal, you can't get it when you need it and so on. But I think there's a negative impact because when you import things, you displace the potential local production. So it's not easily substitutable, particularly for certain countries. Countries like the Bahamas, there's not a lot of capability for agriculture. However, on the regional scale, maybe if CARICOM would stop just planning for food production on a regional basis and find a way to incentivize the private sector. There's a lot of land and water in Belize, Suriname, Guyana that can produce food.
You've been around long enough. You've been around long enough, Ambassador Bernal, to know of the project that the Michael Manley government tried to start between Trinidad, Jamaica, and Guyana to produce food.
Yes.
Way back in the 70s.
And it's interesting, in the late 60s, the justification for CARICOM economic integration was integration of production. The idea, for example, that bauxite in Guyana and Jamaica could be sent to a smelter in Trinidad using its oil and natural gas. Just one example. Agriculture is another one. Yeah. Also, you'd be surprised what happens in the Caribbean. The chicken producers are all rivals without calling any names. I visited a chicken factory in Jamaica. It works 2 shifts a day, 7 days a week. I visited chicken production in a smaller Caribbean country. The factory runs 3 days a week, 1 shift, but they do not want to get together to bulk purchase chicken feed or to share the market. So they're busy protecting their national market at the expense of the consumers. So there are many problems with food production, but there's some room for substitution and growth. It could give the agriculture sector a boost.
I'm not an economist. I have a bachelor's in economics. I never studied economics in depth, okay? But it seems to me, from a layman's perspective, that if governments incentivize collective purchases or imports of, say, fertilizers and so on, they don't have to be the importer. The government shouldn't be the importer. But if private sector form some form of cooperative to import things like fertilizer, maybe the government can reduce the taxes on it if it is purchased in that manner, rather than if individual companies are buying. That would sort of force them into more cooperative structures. But then
here's what I suggest, Ambassador.
You know, something I think they should be talking about.
Here's what I suggest.
Yeah.
The governments have to set up the market arrangements and the policy in a way that incentivizes that to take place.
Yes.
In other words, all the restrictions that would inhibit private corporate collaboration on a regional basis needs to be removed. For example, the Caribbean has a lot of underutilized investment capital. The evidence is clear because you look at the disparity in interest rates among the countries. There shouldn't be any. If there was one single capital market, capital would move from one country to another and you would have a single interest rate across the region. The fact that you have these disparities indicates that you have maybe surplus capital in Trinidad and in another country you don't have enough capital. So you have to create incentives which make the capital market and the private sector operate in a way which is beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I read somewhere, Ambassador Bernal, that the cost of production of Irish potato in Jamaica is several times the cost of the imported Irish potato. And I believe somewhere you had mentioned about the type of agriculture that we do in the Caribbean versus high machinery agriculture and more high-tech agriculture. Is there scope within our smaller structure for greater use of technology in agriculture to lower the prices and so on?
I think we need a balanced food plan which takes accounts of domestic production and imports. Here's what I would suggest. There are some products we're not going to produce, wheat. There are
Right.
some other products that we're not going to produce enough of, maybe high-end beef. Accept that you're going to have some imports, but there are some products that we can produce, and we should take the decision that we, in terms of development, will have a calculus which says it is more beneficial to the economy to produce a good, perhaps slightly more expensive than imports, because of its multiplier effect in employment, taxation, growth, investment,
Exactly.
and everything. There was a time when the Japanese said, we want to eat Japanese rice. We don't want to import it, although we can import it cheaper.
Right.
We want something that allows a balance. Things like Irish potato, Jamaica was self-sufficient back in the 60s, and now we are importing. I believe there are some products that we can produce enough of, and we need to take a position that we are prepared to pay slightly more for those products to have them produced locally because of the multiplier effect across the economy. There's no point in importing something just because it's cheaper. The merchants will do that, but we can't allow the market to sometimes do something which is irrational from the development point of view, but rational from the businessman's point of view. So there is room for a more balanced approach. And we need to educate our consumers. Consumers buy some imported stuff that is old, is not nutritious, full of salt, full of sugar, passing up fresh Jamaican production.
Yes. I totally agree with what you're saying. And you did mention some of the difficulties in transportation and so on and so forth, marketing. And some of these are issues which governments seem to have struggled to implement adequate marketing facilities for farm products. But I want to switch gears a little bit, because in the whole question of development, diaspora remittances have been a major input. As a matter of fact, it has been a lifesaver. And you recently were reported in an article in the Jamaica Gleaner. I believe you did an interview with the Financial Gleaner, and you were quoted on some of these issues. And you pointed out that remittance inflows from around the world, from the diaspora, totaled a whopping $3.5 billion in 2021. And we're talking about a period when tourism was literally shut down and there were no earnings from tourism. So just give us an idea what impact in 2021 and the current flow of the diaspora remittances. Give us an idea of the economic impact on Jamaica that represents.
Let me put that in context by saying it is time for small developing countries like Jamaica to stop seeing themselves in economic terms limited by their physical size. An economy is a network of transactions. It is global. In other words, if there are half as many Jamaicans out of the country as there are in the country, then you're talking about not an economy of 3 million people, but anywhere from 5-6 million. And they are continuously investing, purchasing, importing, traveling, So they are a vital part of the economy. Remittances is the visible indicator of the importance. Remittances are vital to the economy. First of all, it's one of the largest inflows of foreign exchange. And in some Eastern Caribbean countries, it is as large as tourism. So it's vital. It's vital because it goes into investment, construction of houses, starting businesses, farming. It goes into consumption. Many families depend on the remittance for their food and rent. It goes into almost every institution in Jamaica, every school, every hospital, every church benefits from remittances. And therefore, the Jamaican overseas community is an integral part of the economy and should be accorded the kind of importance which that brings with it. So remittances are critical, and a lot of it goes into investment. Very important. A lot of the construction going on in Jamaica is either funded by remittances or the purchases of those apartment buildings and apartments are overseas Jamaicans. So we must stop thinking about Jamaica and its diaspora. It's one nation without borders. It's one economy without borders, because the Jamaicans abroad are buying Jamaican products. They're traveling to Jamaica. They're investing in Jamaica. They are contributing to charity in Jamaica. So it is absolutely vital. And let me mention one other thing about remittances, which is that they can be a vital source of new entrepreneurship. Many of the new exporters are persons who had lived abroad, who know the markets abroad or have connections there, and come and set up businesses. In addition to all of that, the Jamaican community abroad is a vital source of travel. Jamaicans come home, they spend money, and it's not often reflected in the tourism figures, but they are very, very important to the Jamaican economy.
And because they don't stay in the hotels, they don't get counted. But they spend more money in the community than the tourist dollars in the hotel. I always ponder about tourism earnings. The tourism earnings that we often hear about. How much of that remains in Jamaica compared to diaspora remittances, where every dollar comes in, remains in Jamaica, in the sense that it becomes available to the Bank of Jamaica and the commercial banks to pay for imports and so on and so forth. How much of the tourism dollars, apart from, the multiplier effect in labor and supplies and so on, how much of that larger figure really remains in Jamaica?
First of all, the delivery of tourism has a high import content. The food and many of the energy and many of the operations. Secondly, a lot of the tourist industry is foreign owned, therefore profits go out. Thirdly, the operations of some of these hotels tend to keep the expenditure in the hotel, whereas when the Jamaicans come home, they go all over the country and they spend in every part of the country, and that money circulates and multiplies throughout the economy.
Every shopkeeper.
Yes. Well, let us be frank. There's room for both, because the big hotels may have a high import content, but the smaller hotels tend to serve more local food. They tend to rely on more local suppliers. Mm-hmm. But even the big hotels, they have a network. The people who do transport, the workers who work, etc. And they do buy some local food, and the opportunity is there to supply more local food. For example, one hotel told me that there are certain things that they want to serve their guests, which could be grown in the local countries. Let's say Jamaica. I give you a specific example. Purple cabbage is used as a garnish in salads, but it's not produced in large amounts in Jamaica. So it's imported, but it's something that could be produced here. Something has to go on to create a better connection between agriculture and the hotels. Now, let me say this.
Very
The hotels can make more of an effort to use local dishes and local things. Gone are the days when the foreign tourists wanted to eat whatever they had in their country. They have come for an experience. That's why they left their country. They want to try something different. So there's room to reduce the import content. Another thing that irks me is many of the furnishings in these hotels are imported. They make mattresses in Jamaica. They make beds. They make chairs.
Some of the most beautiful furniture made in Jamaica.
Worse than that, if you go into some of the foreign-owned hotels, the art is all prints or reproductions. We have thousands of Jamaican artists, some well-known and expensive, and some very inexpensive. An effort should be made to put Jamaican culture on the walls.
And the entertainment in some of the all-inclusive.
Yes.
But, you know, I want to just give you a quick anecdote. My wife and I were staying at an all-inclusive in Jamaica. And we were on the beach. So we went up to the, the food place on the beach.
Yeah.
And asked them, can I have a steamed fish for lunch? And to my surprise, the guy said, what time do you want to have lunch? Is 1 o'clock good? I said, yes. And at 1 o'clock, they brought 2 steamed fish for my wife and myself.
Yeah.
It's a real Jamaican steamed fish. And other people walked up and saw us eating and said, where did you get that? Where did you get that? The local food. That's not on the menu of any of the several restaurants on the compound. We had the same experience in the Bahamas, where I requested Jamaican breakfast, and we had a Jamaican chef. And next morning, I had ackee and saltfish, callo and saltfish, green banana, Johnny cake and plantain. So Jamaicans tell me all the time, when they go to the all-inclusive, they really would like some Jamaican cuisine.
I can confirm your experience. You go to breakfast and ackee and codfish is not on the menu, but if you ask for it, they have it. And guess why? Remember something. A lot of food has to be served to the staff. And you're not eating certain things like Jamaican food. So often a lot of the food that's bought from Jamaica is to feed the staff. But if you are Jamaican and you say you want ackee and codfish, they have it and you can get it. And they're only too happy to serve it to you.
Oh, they love it. They love it. But Ambassador Bernal, let me say it. This has been a very, very informative conversation we've had. And we've touched on quite a lot. And we've concentrated a great deal on the economies across the Caribbean, the impact on the economies. And there could be no better person to speak on these issues than you. So I really want to thank you for coming on Real Talk with Ambassador Curtis Ward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It has been my pleasure. Curtis, I want to add something which you can use as you see fit.
Sure.
I outlined the current economic circumstances and that the outlook for the Caribbean economies is one with challenges. I want to say, however, all is not lost. There is room for possibilities for growth. I want to give you one example. The Caribbean economies can do offshore healthcare. The cost of healthcare in the United States is very high. You have a large, fairly affluent population. and we could supply them with medical services in locations like Bahamas and Jamaica. We have the doctors and nurses. Our cost advantage is that these people would not migrate. They would be earning US dollars in Jamaica. Maybe not as much as in the US, but enough to keep them there. This cost advantage means that we could attract persons from the United States to provide healthcare to them for much lower costs in Jamaica. It's a vast industry with unlimited potential, sitting beside the biggest demand for healthcare services in the United States. I want to end on a positive note.
Yeah, and I want to tell you, it is access to that kind of healthcare which encourages retirees in the diaspora to move to Jamaica for retirement. And again, that's a very positive.
Well, let me add one thing to that, which is there's a synergy between tourist hotels, retirement homes, and healthcare. Remember, the average traveler nowadays is older. Remember that if you have world-class healthcare, and what is needed for Americans to come is they need brand names, American brand names like Johns Hopkins and Sloan Kettering and Mayo Clinic, which is possible because you get them to invest, you cut in the local medical practitioners as shareholders, and it works. Now, when you have global quality healthcare, people will retire in Jamaica.
Of course.
And the beach, the hotels are on the beach. Across the road is the clinic and the retirement place. And there's a synergy. Retirement people go to the hotel for dinner and lunch. When they're young, grandchildren come to stay at the hotel and come across the road and visit. The retirement home industry is even better than tourism. It has no seasonality. It's one entry and one exit. There is no senior,
and it's long term, and it's long term stay.
And also, it's not just brain surgeons, doctors, nurses that are involved. You have caregivers and a whole range of services, because often old people don't need regular intense medical treatment. What they want is assistance in daily things in their life, and it is
availability, readily available to them when they need it. There's always a fear in the mind of an older person. Will I be able to get adequate health care when I need it?
In fact, I've written a book with Dr. Henry Lowe about this. So one day we can discuss it.
We can talk about that some. I really want to thank you, Ambassador Bernal, for being my guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It has been my pleasure, Ambassador Ward.